Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth.
How do you make a good decision? It's Make Your Mind Up time. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
Take the red pill, take the blue pill. Save one life or many. Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris? Lauryn Hill or Lil Kim? Trump or Biden? Trump, high road, low road. Scone or scone? LMS or LXP? Life is full of decisions, and most of us struggle to take those decisions. I don't. Often we're in two minds. I'm not. Cynical Bambino, you're not even in one mind. My guest this time on The Learning Hack is someone who specialises in decisions. Matthew Confer is a leadership expert who runs simulation training events for business leaders around the world. I wanted to hear about the advice he gives those learners when it comes to taking tough decisions in tight spots.
Question that I get frequently is, how do I make a decision when time really isn't on my side?
And how these business leaders, responsible for the health and livelihood of whole workforces, are coping with the tough decisions that confront us all in the global pandemic. So I've got a problem, Matthew. I'm hoping you can help me with. I thought long and hard about the question to ask you first, because the first question you ask in a podcast interview is very important. I went back and forth with this. I couldn't make a decision. As someone who has worked with leaders of some of the world's finest organizations, I think you can see where I'm going with this. How would you help me make that decision?
Well, first off, John, thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here. One of my favorite decision-making techniques is actually to work backwards. Right. So you kind of imagine the conclusion you desire and you work backwards to figure out how to get there. So in this case, I guess you would need to think a little bit about your listeners and think about yourself as a host. What do you want the audience to get out of the show? How do you want the show to flow? If you imagine and visualize that end state, it can put you in a position to think about the right question to kick off with. And I honestly, I have to give you a little bit of credit. A first question that asks how you should decide what question to ask is a real solid start to any podcast.
Yeah, well, I think my listeners have come to expect a load of cheesy jokes like that, so I thought I'd start me to go on. But that's a fairly trivial question. In your TED talk, you give an example of something making a much more important decision, something with life or death consequences, the pilot in a failing plane. Can you talk us through that story for the benefit of people who haven't seen the TED talk and what it tells us about decision making?
Sure. So the focus of the TED Talk was on the period before you make a decision. So that's actually why we entitled the talk Before You Decide. And in that talk, I share a 3-step decision-making framework. And the final story that I told from the stage showcased all of those 3 steps. And it was a story that many of us are familiar with. It was from 2009, and it was when Sully Sullenberger actually landed a plane on the Hudson River after that plane had struck a flock of Canadian geese, and it required this masterful display of decision-making. So the first step in the Before You Decide decision-making framework is to challenge the constraints. You really need to consider what barriers are holding you back and not simply fall into the way you've done things in the past. So it's hard for me to argue that part of Sully's success isn't partly the result of the fact that landing on the Hudson River is really challenging the constraints. And after the event, actually, Sully talked about the fact that given that he was in New York City, which is obviously one of the most densely populated places on the planet, it was the Hudson River, even though it was an extreme outcome, that was actually the best chance for a safe outcome. So it was challenging of the constraints, but it was also considering what was really possible given the constraints he was under. And that is in some ways a perfect lead into the second step of the decision-making framework, which is about embracing and conducting a postmortem. So we're all very familiar with a postmortem, but the second step in my framework is actually called a pre-mortem. We have to invest the time up front, really considering that something might fail. And it's a little bit counterintuitive because most of us think about making a decision and then think about all of the grandiose ways that will be successful. And so if I go back to the Sully story, he actually believed that he could land the plane intact in the river, but he started to think about how long would the aircraft float? And given that it was January, like, could they actually do a rescue in the freezing Hudson River? So he actually went through a pre-mortem of, even if this goes right, how could it fail? And I think that's a really powerful step on a decision-making path that a lot of us don't go through. And then the third and final step of the before you decide decision-making framework is to check the basics. And what I found is, as decisions become more complex, it's the small details that trip people up. And the reference of the Sully story was, as he was getting close to the water, he asked his co-pilot to shout out airspeed, shout out altitude, to provide those kind of critical basic details that in many ways ended up leading to everybody on the plane surviving. So I'm a big fan of stories, and the Sully story is where I closed my TED Talk because I think it did a really good job of hitting all three steps of the decision-making framework.
I think it's a great story because when you talk about things like decision-making frameworks and you have steps you go through, people are liable to say, well, you know, we haven't got the time to go through all that. Obviously, in this case, it all happened very quickly. I mean, the pre-mortem, you know, happened very quickly in his head because you're in a plane that's failing. You haven't got an awful lot of time to kind of make the decision. So that's really interesting. And it deals with that kind of objection. But one thing I wonder about that is I'm aware that there's something in leadership learning, in my brushes with it in the past, called situational leadership, that says leadership style flexes with the situation. So, you know, in a crisis, you become more directive, for instance. Does the style of our decision making similarly flex according to the situation we're in? I mean, if you're on the failing plane, that is a crisis situation where you would expect to operate in a certain way. When you have more leisure, perhaps, and are looking a bit longer term than, you know, staying alive in the next hour, would you adopt a different approach, or does it stay the same?
Well, a key principle of situational leadership is that there's no single best style of leadership. And I would concur with that premise when it comes to decision making. The best approach is in many ways to have a toolkit that you can employ depending on the challenge that you're presented with. And a question that I get frequently is, how do I make a decision when time really isn't on my side? It's awesome if you can put in this framework that has multi-steps and you can spend weeks or days thinking about it. But what if time just isn't on my side? And this is where I think flexing and being agile is really powerful. And I usually throw out two different options if time isn't on your side when it comes to a decision. And option one, if it's a competitive decision, the quickest thing you can do is put your mind in the body of your adversary and think, what would they not want you to do? And you should do that. And it's a really quick way to reframe the challenge. If you're in an adversarial position and you're about to make a decision, think like your opponent. People talk about this in sports all of the time. When the opposing coach has a decision to make, many times the best thing they can do is think about, what do the fans of the opposing team not want you to do? And you should do that. It might actually represent the best way to think about quick decisions. So that's kind of option one when you're presented with the decision and you don't have a lot of time. Option two is you actually scale it out. So you take just 1 to 10 and you say, you know, how would I rank this decision that I'm considering? 1 being this is a bad decision, 10 being this is a great decision. but you can't use the number 7. And the reason is a lot of us default to 7. For some reason, it feels safe. And what happens is when you actually pull 7 out, what you find is that if you're ranking this decision and it ends up being a 10, a 9, or an 8, you should probably do it. And if it's a 6 or below, you should probably not do it. And 7 becomes this safe answer. And when you remove it completely, it really forces you to choose a side. Should you do it or should you not?
On the subject of a pre-mortem, I know you've written about another example, which is an interesting one to think about with pre-mortem, and that has something to do with snakes. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stories of all time. So the concept of a pre-mortem, it's in many ways, it's human nature. As I said earlier, you strategize an approach, and then if you're in that brainstorming stage, you formulate and you think about all of these ways that it's going to be successful. And it really is great to envision your success. But in many instances of what I observe in my work is people don't spend enough time thinking about how a decision they're contemplating could end in failure. And from the TED stage, I told a story about cobra snakes, as you referenced, in India. And during the era of colonialization, the British government was concerned about the number of venomous cobra snakes in Delhi. There were countless failed ideas that they tried. They finally offered a cash bounty for every dead snake. And initially, this was an extremely successful strategy, as a large number of snakes were killed for this new reward. The problem is something maybe you could guess. Imagine if individuals started to breed snakes explicitly for the money that they could now generate. It didn't take long. The government becomes aware of this, and very quickly they have to scrap the reward program. Well, you can probably definitely guess what happens next. What happens next is you have a ton of snake breeders who now have worthless snakes. So they just set them free. And in the end, the cobra population becomes even worse than it was initially. And so in many ways, the apparent solution for the problem made the situation even worse. And people actually now refer to this as the cobra effect. And I think in many ways, it's the perfect illustration of the power of a pre-mortem. You have to put yourself in a position where you think about how a decision you're considering could end in abject failure and act to mitigate those responses.
I'd like to challenge that story in a way. Okay, it's a good example of what you might call a perverse incentive. But also it's an example of the law of unintended consequences. And that's every politician's nightmare, and business leaders as well. And Max Weber said something to the effect that, I hope I'm not massively misquoting him here, that the mark of a politician, their political responsibility, is how they deal with the unintended consequences of their actions. And I think we can think about a lot of leaders where that comes into play. And it must affect business leaders as well. But surely even the best pre-mortem in the world there will be unintended consequences from your decisions, things that you couldn't possibly have foreseen that happen. So how do you counsel leaders when it comes to dealing with that very difficult area of decision making?
I think it is one of the most difficult areas of decision making. And I'll actually hearken back to your first question about how you start the podcast. And I said, to a certain extent, if you work backwards. And one of the leaders that I think does a really good job of thinking about this and thinking about unforeseen consequences is actually Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And they have a decision-making framework that they refer to internally as the press release method. And what it basically means is before a team at Amazon begins the process of creating a new product or before they roll out a new feature on the website, they actually have to write up a fictitious press release for the finished product before there is any product. This is simply in the development stage. And the idea is you have to focus on how somebody will feel and react to hearing about this for the first time. It doesn't prevent any unforeseen consequences. Just like a pre-mortem doesn't really let you get in front of it, but it puts you in the mind of your end consumer or your constituent or the stakeholder that you're dealing with. And you can't foresee everything, But if you get yourself in a decision-making mindset where you're considering all options, I think when that fork in the road or when that curveball, that weird event happens, you're a little bit more prepared for it because you've done the mental exercise of thinking about the crazies, the unforeseen. You do the pre-mortem, you consider what the end state will be. You're a little bit more prepared to handle those unforeseen events.
We can't ignore the subject of COVID-19 at the moment, something that's forced people all over the world to make some really difficult decisions, and the type of decisions that end up being dilemmas. There doesn't seem to be a good thing you can do. What have you observed during the crisis that we might draw some lessons from about decision-making, good and bad?
The firm I work for does leadership training in countries all around the world. And in a pre-COVID world, give or take 80% of the trainings that we did were in a classroom, at the corporate headquarters, at maybe a hotel conference room, resort style kind of leadership training, high potential programs, new manager, executive development. And there was a real push to do these types of events in person for the networking, the camaraderie, and all of that. We had previously done a small portion of our work in a fully virtual context, trying to prepare for a world that we thought might be the normal state years into the future. COVID obviously is much more of an accelerant than any of us could have imagined. And what I've been unbelievably impressed with our clients is putting the safety of their employees first was the number one thing that they were focused on. And there was nothing that was even close to number two. So their ability to pivot and strategize ways to deliver the learning objectives that they had, but embrace a fully virtual modality, it was incredible to me how fast people moved, how fast people were able to say, we've been planning for 6 to 8 months for 40 leaders from offices all around the region to come to a central location. We need to scrap everything and redraw what that would look like for everybody to be logged in to a virtual conference. I think I've been impressed with the agility. I think I've been impressed with how people have held to their main values, employee safety being one of them. I think the other thing that has impressed me from a decision-making context is we're always taught to have, the plan B, the plan C. It's incredible to me how fast people spun up alternative plans that reflected a world that they never could have imagined 3 to 4 months ago. So I think agility and ability to adapt to a world that you maybe never could have imagined has set some people apart in the decision-making realm. Interesting.
And could you think of some examples you've seen of really poor decision-making, or don't you want to go there?
The biggest examples when we see poor decision-making, it's a level of inability to see what could potentially happen. You become so wedded to what you hoped would happen that you never plan for alternatives. It might be silly conversations that you need to have at the end of every meeting, just saying something to the effect of, if this doesn't go according to plan, who's going to handle the communication to senior leadership? Who's going to get in touch with our key stakeholders in this region? Who's going to be our point person when things go awry? And if things divulge in a bad direction in this way or this way, what's our response going to be? It doesn't have to be the bulk of a meeting, a planning process. You don't have to become just a fear mongerer who is thinking the worst in any situation. But if you're in a leadership context, your people knowing that you've had those conversations, or they're at least in the back of your mind, if the worst does happen, I think you've gained a level of credibility, because in a period where there isn't turmoil, you've at least brought up the topic of how we're going to handle things if they don't go according to plan. When we host an event, virtual or in the classroom, we're always talking about, what happens if the technology doesn't comply? What happens if we're supposed to have 20 people in the room, but 2 people need to step out. You need to be scenario planning for unforeseen things. It gives your team more confidence and it lets you be a more competent leader.
Experience.
It's everything that ever happened to you, everything that ever will. Experiences, both huge and not so huge, slowly add up over a lifetime to become your experience. Everything you know, everything you are.
Experience.
And now the experience word is taking over learning.
Learning experience.
Our learning experience.
Learning experience design.
Learning experiences.
And some worry that the change will distract from what science has told us about how people learn. Do we even know what we mean by the words learning experience? Is this a learning experience? Or this? Or this? I've talked to some incredibly smart designers, theoreticians, L&D practitioners, and technologists on behalf of the good people at Learning. And together we've created a series of guides and resources to help you get the best from this change. Download the first of these now, the Experience White Paper.
Experience.
It's going to seem a bit like we're doing the interview backwards now, because so I'd like to ask you how you got into the whole area of learning and leadership learning. What's been your personal journey towards what you do today?
When I went to university, I originally thought that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I quickly found out that the world of economics and business is where I belonged. And I've kind of found my way in and out of those fields since. That original journey actually brought me to Deloitte Consulting in Boston, Massachusetts, where I was living at the time. And I spent about the first 7.5 years of my career in a consulting context. And for those who have worked in it or for those who are aware of it, I think it's an incredible place to start a career. You learn from exceedingly brilliant people and you get to see different industries kind of from the ground up, how they operate and how they think. For me, it wasn't the right thing long-term, but I was able to ascend to a managerial position at Deloitte. And one of the last projects that I ever did was actually putting together some of the new hire onboarding training that we did for the recent college and university grads that we were bringing on board. And I think it forever changed the lens that I looked at things. I really enjoyed brainstorming and talking about what do future employees at our organization need to know about what it takes to be successful. And then I actually had the opportunity to facilitate some of that training. So the path from Deloitte to where I am today was winding and it was a lot of fun. But I think that last project really led me to reframe in my own head what I kind of wanted to do in my career. And about 2.5 years ago, I joined a company called Abilitie. We're based in Austin, Texas. I run the strategy team here. We're a provider of leadership simulations for universities and corporations in about 30 countries around the world. And at our core, we're really firm believers in real world practice without real world consequences. So we've built these team-based simulations to allow people to practice skills like people management, business, financial acumen, and of course, decision-making. They're fully virtual training events. And I feel very lucky. We get to work with some of the most innovative companies on the planet across about 20 or so different industries. So we get to see how leaders make decisions around the world and in a bevy of different industries.
What advice do you have for leaders who are having to manage the perhaps even more difficult part of getting out of this crisis?
One of the things that we've noticed is previously we had a lot of clients and partners of ours who thought in terms of quarters or biannual planning or annual planning of what they want to do and how they want to communicate with their team, what's the next step that we're going on. What we've seen is a shrinking of that timeline. Previously, maybe our organization would get together every 2 weeks and talk retrospectively and then kind of proactively what's coming next. Now we might be doing that twice a week or even day. And I think we're also seeing that in our world, whereas previously people were thinking 6, 12, 18 months out into the future, what does training look like? What does development look like at our organization? They're taking a much more contracted lens to that. And as leaders and as developers of the future talent, we're seeing people think more concretely about what needs to happen in the next week, the next 2 weeks, even the next day or the next month in a way that I never really saw before. And on a personal note, our team is doing that. We were previously a team that tried to not have a real meeting culture, and we tried to more operate with agility as kind of a key tenet of where we focus. Now we're trying to meet more consistently, keep up to date on what's going on, and change and iterate with higher speed, but with more touch points between our team. And I think that would be a big suggestion that I would make to leaders. When we can't see each other in person with the regularity that we had become accustomed to, we need to meet more frequently. We need to convey and communicate more openly and more consistently, but maybe on shorter intervals.
Yeah. So there is no BAU really to return to. Things still remain changed as we come out of that. Lastly, Matthew, it's been a brilliant conversation for me. How can people follow your work and thought? What's the best way for them to contact you as well if they want to do that?
Well, thanks, John. I've really enjoyed the conversation as well. The best place to reach me is on Twitter and LinkedIn. My handle there is at Matthew Confer, just my name. I also host a podcast for our organization focused on the world of leadership development, which is entitled Learn to Lead. And you can find that on your whatever podcast app of choice by just simply typing in Learn to Lead. And I would love to connect with your audience on whatever platform they prefer and hear more about what they're working on and what they're interested in.
Thank you very much for taking the time.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Matthew and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube. And don't forget to leave a review and a 5-star rating if you want other people to find us too. You can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. Next time, we're talking about women in learning with Sharon Claffey-Kalyubi, and the podcast after that will be given over to an exciting new startup led by Andrea Miles. Stay classy, learning people.
Now I finally get it.
Well, that's the podcast over. What should I do next? A cup of tea, maybe? Hold on, what did Matthew say? Challenge the constraints. Maybe it doesn't have to be a cup of tea. It could be a whiskey. Yes, but I better do a pre-mortem. Might not be just one whiskey. There might be a second and a third. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. I could wipe out the whole day. Dull. I still can't make a decision.